The sworn deposition of Lieutenant Emilian Varga, supply officer, 3rd Infantry Regiment, Imperial and Royal Army of Austria-Hungary, was recorded by the Military Inquiry Commission at Cluj-Napoca on the 14th of December, 1888. The following account is reproduced in its entirety, translated from the original German, at the request of the lieutenant himself, who declined to allow any portion of his statement to be summarized or condensed. What you are about to read is what he said. It is what he saw. And he believed, when he said it, that someone in the world besides him needed to know. In November of 1888, a 43-man Imperial garrison was found dead inside Fortress Kereshegi in the Carpathian foothills of Transylvania. Every man was at his post. Every man bore the same 2 wounds at the throat. Not a gate had been forced. Not a wall had been breached. Whatever came into that fortress on the night of the 2nd of November moved through locked stone, as if stone were nothing, and it left every man in it cold and pale and still, and the only person who survived was the one man who was not there. My name is Emilian Varga. I am 31 years of age. I hold the rank of lieutenant in the 3rd Infantry Regiment, Imperial and Royal Army, and I have served 8 years in that capacity, the last 3 as a supply and logistics officer, assigned to forward detachments in the Carpathian region of Transylvania. I am appearing before this commission not as a suspect, and not as a witness to the act of killing itself, but as the officer who returned to Fortress Kereshegi on the morning of the 3rd of November, 1888, and found what was left of his garrison. I am going to tell the commission what I found. I am also going to tell the commission what led up to it, because the inquiry's preliminary conclusion that the garrison died from contaminated water is incorrect, and the record should reflect what actually happened rather than what is convenient to believe. I want to say at the outset that I am not a man of unusual imagination. I keep ledgers. I count things. I track the weight and movement of supplies across difficult terrain in difficult weather, and my ability to do that work depends entirely on my accuracy. I cannot afford to see things that are not there. I also cannot afford to ignore things that are. What I am about to describe I observed directly, and I will stake my career and my commission on its accuracy. If the commission finds my account incredible, that is their prerogative, but I will not adjust it to make it easier to dismiss. Let me begin with the fortress itself, because you cannot understand what happened there without understanding the place. Fortress Kereshegi sits on a low limestone promontory above the Kereshegi Gorge, approximately 40 kilometers northeast of Cluj-Napoca. The road to it rises through dense spruce forest from the valley floor, following the western edge of the gorge for the last several kilometers before the approach opens onto the stone-flagged track that leads to the main gate. When we arrived in early October, the trees on either side of the approach had already begun to turn, and the whole hillside was copper and gold in the autumn light, and it was striking country. But there is something about that promontory that does not feel like it belongs to beautiful country. It sits above the valley in a way that is permanent and heavy, the way very old things sometimes sit in a landscape, as if it had not been built there but had always been there, and the builders had only uncovered it. The Habsburg surveys of the previous century catalogued the fortress as a 15th century fortified structure with possible earlier foundations. Our own preliminary inspection raised questions about the lower sections of the keep. The stonework in the basement and sub-basement levels was noticeably different from the rest of the structure. Tighter cuts, a different grade of limestone, a jointing technique that our engineer, Corporal Fekete, identified as predating anything in the regional survey records by a considerable margin. He could not say how old it was. He could say that it was old enough that the 15th century builders had built on top of it rather than through it, which implied they had found it already standing and had chosen to incorporate the foundation rather than replace it. There was also the question of depth. The official surveys indicated 2 subterranean levels, a main cellar, used for provisions and equipment, and a lower storage room partially filled with rubble from a structural repair in the previous century. Our inspection confirmed the main cellar, which was in adequate condition, accessed by a stone staircase from the inner court. The lower room was accessible from the main cellar by a secondary staircase that had been partially blocked by a collapsed timber rack. It was Private Hantosi who discovered, on the 9th of October, that behind the collapsed rack there was a passage. Not a room, a passage. It was approximately a meter wide and perhaps slightly higher, cut into the limestone below the subfloor of the lower storage room, descending at a shallow angle into darkness. Hantosi had pushed the collapsed rack aside to check the floor beneath for moisture damage, and had found the opening, and had put his lantern into it, and had seen the passage going down, and had come immediately to find me. I went down with him and a second lamp. I put the lamp into the passage and looked. The passage went down. Beyond the reach of the lamp, which was a good lamp, the passage continued into a dark so complete and so thick that it seemed to press back against the light. I did not go into the passage. I put the lamp to the edge and looked, and I did not go in, because the passage was cold in a way that had nothing to do with the season. Even standing at the entrance I could feel it, a cold that came up from below that was not the cold of still air, but something more directed, as if the cold were moving upward through the passage rather than simply resting in it. And from the passage, faintly, at the very edge of perception, there was something that I cannot precisely call a sound. It was more a frequency. The way you perceive the lowest register of a church organ, not with your ears, but with your chest. Something at the edge of hearing that was less a sound than a presence of vibration in the stone around the passage entrance. I sealed the passage with Hantosi and another man. We wedged timber planks across the opening and secured them with metal brackets from the equipment stores. I logged the discovery and the sealing in my field report, which I submitted to Captain Ballon that evening. He acknowledged the report and noted that he would communicate the discovery to regimental command in his next dispatch. He did so. I have confirmed this with the dispatch records. That was the 9th of October. We lost the first horse on the 15th. I should be precise about what I mean by that. The horse did not die. It stopped being the horse it had been. On the morning of the 15th, when the stable hand went to feed the animals at first light, he found the mare in the corner stall, standing with her head pressed against the stone wall and her eyes half closed. Not asleep. Her eyes were open, but she was not responsive in any normal way. She was sweating despite the cold. When the stable hand touched her flank, she made a sound that was neither a whinny nor a cry, but something between the two, and she pressed harder against the wall. He came to find me. I went to the stable. I examined the horse. She had no fever, no injury, no signs of digestive illness. Her breathing was elevated. Her heart was elevated. She was frightened of something she could not get away from. The stable hand was a local man from the nearest village, which was called Somos, approximately 6 kilometers down the valley. His name was Garrison, and he was perhaps 50 years old, a broad-shouldered man who had worked with horses all his life, and who had taken the garrison work for the additional income. He was the calmest man in the entire detachment, calmer than most of the soldiers, in the particular way that men who work with large animals develop a steadiness that others do not have. I mention this because what he said to me that morning about the horse was the most important thing anyone said to me in the entire 8 weeks at Fortress Karashegi. He said the horse was listening. I asked him what she was listening to. He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, in the mixture of Romanian and German we had developed for our communication, that there was something below the fortress. He said this matter-of-factly, without alarm, in the tone of a man reporting the weather. He said that the old people in Somos had always known there was something below the fortress. He said they did not come here for that reason. He had taken the work anyway, because he needed the money, and because he had not thought it would concern a military garrison. He was reconsidering that now, he said. I asked him what the old people in Somos said about what was below the fortress. He looked at me for a moment. Then he said that it was old, older than the fortress, older than anything the Habsburgs had built. He said the Romanian word for it, which I cannot reproduce here, and when I pressed him to translate, the closest he could give me in German was something that breathes in stone. He said the word was very old, and that he had only heard the oldest people in the village use it. He said that when it was hungry, it came up, and that the village knew when it was hungry, because the animals began to listen. I wrote this down in my personal log. I did not include it in my official report to Balin, because I did not know how to include it without appearing to have taken leave of my rational faculties. 2 nights later, Private Hantosi came to me at morning assembly with his description of the vibration. He was specific about it, which is what made me take note. He was not a nervous man. He said it was not something you heard with your ears, but something you felt in your back teeth and in your chest. He said it lasted approximately 30 seconds on the first occurrence, and had happened twice during his watch, each occurrence separated by a long silence. He said that when it happened the second time, the lantern on the south parapet moved. I asked him how he meant. He said the lantern swung, a slow arc, back and forth, as if something had passed underneath it, though the air was still. I asked him several follow-up questions that I believe are relevant. I asked whether the vibration had a direction, whether it felt as if it were coming from a specific part of the structure. He thought about this carefully before answering. Then he said it felt as though it were coming from below. From below the floor of the parapet he was standing on, which was to say from somewhere deep in the foundations of the wall, possibly from the sub-basement level where we had found the passage, possibly from even further down. I asked him what he thought it was. He said he did not know, but that he had felt it once before, briefly, when he had been in the main cellar 2 days after we arrived, and that at the time he had assumed it was vibration conducted from the river through the limestone. I asked whether he still thought that was the explanation. He said it felt like something breathing. I thanked him and excused him, and sat with that for a long time. Over the following 4 nights, 6 other soldiers reported variations of the same experience. I interviewed each of them separately, without allowing them to compare notes beforehand. Their descriptions varied in small details, but were consistent in the important ones. A vibration in the stone, felt primarily in the chest and jaw rather than heard through the ears, occurring during the night hours, lasting between 30 seconds and several minutes per occurrence, and increasing in frequency as the night progressed, so that the final hours before dawn were when it was most consistently present. 2 of the men independently described the experience as similar to standing near a large bell after it had been struck. One man, Private Colossi, said it was like having a sound inside you rather than around you. I brought all of this to Captain Balin on the 21st of October. Balin listened without interruption. He was a methodical man, 51 years old, 20 years of service in varied terrain, including 2 frontier postings and 1 survey expedition through the Balkan Range. He was not a man given to dismissal. He was also not a man given to the kind of alarm that spreads through a garrison before you have enough information to know whether it is warranted. He sat with my report for several minutes after I finished. Then he said the vibration was most probably hydraulic. The Gorge River was running high for the season, and water pressure transmitted through limestone could produce unusual acoustic effects, especially in an old structure with a complex foundation. He said he would have Corporal Fakete examine the foundation for stress fractures. I said, "And the horses?" Balin said that animals were sensitive to low-frequency vibration in ways that humans were not, and that if the soldiers were beginning to feel it, the horses had probably been feeling it since we arrived. This was a reasonable explanation. I believed it at the time. I want the Commission to understand that I believed it, because I think it is important to establish that none of us were looking for a supernatural explanation. We were looking for the most logical one. Balin found one and applied it, and for several days it held. Then on the 23rd of October in the stable, the horses went silent all at once. I was in my office working on supply ledgers at approximately 2 in the morning when the change in the sound of the stable reached me. For the preceding hour I had been hearing the animals shifting and stamping, the normal restless nighttime noise of horses in an enclosed space. Then it stopped, not gradually, all at once, as if someone had closed a door on the sound. The silence lasted approximately 4 minutes. 4 minutes is a long time for 12 horses to produce no noise whatsoever. Then one horse screamed. I do not use that word lightly. It was not the whinny of a startled animal. It was a sustained, high vocalization of a kind I had not heard a horse produce before. It lasted perhaps 8 seconds. Then all 12 animals began screaming at once, and I could hear them throwing themselves against the stall walls. And I grabbed my lantern and my sidearm and ran down to the stable. Sergeant Moritz was already there with 2 privates. The horses had broken their tethers and were pressing themselves into the far corners of the stalls. 2 of them had injured themselves against the walls. Garrison was standing at the entrance to the stable with a lamp in one hand and a short-handled axe in the other, which I found significant enough to ask about. He walked me to the outside wall of the stable, on the east face, and held his lamp close to the stone. There were marks in the old mortar between the courses of stone. Not scratches, impressions. As if something had pressed into the mortar from the outside with great force, leaving 4 parallel channels, each approximately 3 centimeters wide, and spaced at irregular intervals. The impressions went from knee height to above the roofline, 12 feet of stone, more or less. Whatever had made those marks had moved upward along the outside of the stable wall. I want the Commission to note the width of those channels, 3 centimeters each. I also want to note that the marks were not there the previous afternoon. I had passed that wall at dusk during my evening inspection, and I would have noted marks of that size in the old mortar. I reported this to Captain Balin that night. This time I woke him. He came to the stable, examined the marks by lantern light, and was quiet for a long moment. He said he wanted the wall photographed in the morning light and sent for our survey team's glass plate camera. He said no one was to discuss the marks with the men until he had decided how to address it. Moritz said, "Show me what kind of bear leaves marks that high, in a straight line up a stone wall." Balin told him to keep his opinions to himself until the morning. Moritz did not put the axe down. In the morning, the photographs were taken. They confirmed what we had seen, and that day Balin addressed the garrison. He told them that they were stationed in mountain territory and that mountain animals sometimes investigated enclosures where horses were kept, and that additional watch rotations would be posted on the outer walls overnight. He was steady and clear about it. The men received the news without visible alarm. Most of them were regulars with years of service, and they trusted Balin. What Balin did not tell them was that he had spent the previous hour re-examining the old garrison records stored in the fortress archives. He had found a note in the margin of a supply ledger from 1743, written in a hand different from the main ledger entries. The note was in Romanian. When I had Garrison translate it privately the following morning, it read, "Do not go below the sealed room. It has always been here. It was here before this fortress was built. It will be here after. Feed it or wall it. There is no third choice." Captain Balin showed me this note privately. He then resealed the archive and instructed me to say nothing to the other officers. I agreed, because Balin was my commanding officer, and I trusted his judgment. I am telling the Commission now because Balin is dead, and because I believe the note is relevant to understanding what subsequently occurred. I will also tell the Commission that we should have left the fortress that day. That is my belief now, looking backward. But at the time, leaving would have required an order from Balin, and Balin believed in the structure. He believed that the answer to an unknown danger was discipline, fortification, and additional observation. He put 2 men on each outer wall, doubled the night watch, and sent a written request to regimental command for guidance on the old passage we had sealed. He did the right things by every measure of military protocol. The protocol simply did not account for what was in that fortress with us. The nights of the 25th and 26th of October passed without incident. The horses had calmed somewhat. The vibration in the stone continued, reported now by nearly every man who stood the night watch, but it did not escalate. For 2 days it seemed possible that Balin's reinforced watch had produced a deterrent effect. I remember feeling something close to relief on the morning of the 27th. And then on the evening of the 27th, Sergeant Moritz told me that Private Hantosi had not appeared for the afternoon watch change. Hantosi was a conscientious man. He had never missed a watch change in the 6 weeks we had been at Kereshegi. Moritz said he had looked in the barracks and the mess and found no sign of him. I took my lantern and walked the outer walls, checking each station. At the northwest corner tower, I found Hantosi's rifle leaning against the parapet. His jacket was folded on the bench beside it. His boots were placed neatly together on the stone floor, as if he had set them down deliberately. There was no other sign of him. I want the Commission to understand the significance of the boots. A man who falls from a wall does not remove his boots and fold his jacket beforehand. A man who jumps does not leave his rifle. The arrangement of those items was deliberate, but it was not Hantosi who arranged them. We searched for him through the night. We did not find him. Captain Balin sent an emergency communication to Regimental Command the following morning, requesting instruction. He wrote that a soldier had gone missing under circumstances that could not be explained by desertion, accident, or medical cause. He wrote that the fortress presented unusual conditions that warranted review by a senior officer. He was measured in his language, as he always was. The reply came 3 days later, instructing him to continue the mission and submit a full written report within 10 days. On the 30th of October, the vibration changed. This is the thing I want the Commission to focus on above anything else I have said. For 2 weeks, the vibration had been a phenomenon of the night watch, a low pulse in the stone that occurred in the dark hours and faded before dawn. On the 30th of October, it began in the afternoon. At approximately 4 o'clock, while the garrison was at mess, every man in the dining hall stopped what he was doing at the same moment and looked up. No one spoke for several seconds. Then Sergeant Moritz said quietly that it was happening during the day now, and everyone at the table knew exactly what he meant, because they could all feel it, that low presence in the stone beneath them, not quite a sound, not quite a tremor, but something between, something that moved through the limestone like a slow, cold pressure wave and settled in the jaw and the sternum and refused to leave. It lasted 45 seconds. I timed it on my pocket watch. Then it faded, and the mess hall was quiet, and Private Deke said that he wanted to leave. Not an appeal to authority, not a formal complaint, a plain statement. He wanted to leave the fortress. Several men around the table nodded. Balin was in the doorway. He heard this. He said he understood, and that he was going to request permission to relocate the detachment pending a structural inspection. He said that within 72 hours, he would have a response from command, and if command agreed, they would begin moving the supply inventory to the secondary station at Bistrita. He was calm when he said it. The men settled. I believe they would have held together for 72 hours. The fortress did not give them 72 hours. After dinner, Moritz came to find me in my office. He said that he thought the sealed passage in the cellar was not sealed anymore. Not that he had checked it, he said. It was a feeling he had when he was in the main cellar that afternoon, before the vibration in the mess hall. A feeling that the air in the cellar was moving upward, a slow movement you could only detect if you held a lamp at the right angle and watched the flame. He said the flame leaned toward the ceiling, as if something below was pushing air upward through a gap in the floor. I asked him if he had checked the timber planks we had wedged over the passage entrance. He said he had not wanted to check alone. I took a lamp and we went to the sub-basement storage room together. The timber planks were still in position, still secured with the metal brackets, but Moritz was right about the air. Standing at the sealed entrance to the passage, holding the lamp close, I could see the flame lean toward the ceiling. Something below was moving air upward with enough force to push it through whatever gap existed around our improvised seal, and beneath the planks, faint enough that I was not certain I was hearing it, and not imagining it, the vibration. Not in the stone of the walls, in the planks themselves. The wood was trembling against the brackets, a fine tremor that I could feel when I pressed my palm against the surface. Something below was producing a vibration sufficient to be felt in timber, not in contact with the earth, suspended across a stone opening. I said nothing to Moritz. I replaced the debris over the rack. We went back upstairs. I went to Ballin's office and told him what we had found. He listened. Then he said, "We leave in 72 hours, whether command responds or not." I said I thought 72 hours was still possible. He agreed. The fortress did not allow 72 hours. On the 1st of November, I left Karashegi at 3 in the afternoon. I have said this already, and I will say it again for the record. I left the fortress on the afternoon of the 1st of November at Ballin's direct order to collect medications and lamp oil from the supply depot at Dej. This was a scheduled supply collection I had arranged 10 days earlier. The timing was not Ballin's design. It was not anyone's design. The supplies were ready and they needed to be collected, and I was the officer responsible for collecting them. Ballin did not send me away to save me. He sent me because I was the supply officer, and those were my supplies. I remember the ride out through the gorge road in the afternoon light. I remember looking back once at the fortress from the turn in the road where the trees first opened, enough to give a clear view of the promontory. The fortress was grey in the late afternoon light, heavy and old against the hillside, and the sky above it was the particular dark blue that November sky has in the mountains before dusk. I remember thinking that I was glad to be riding away from it, and that I would be glad to ride away from it permanently in 2 days' time. I arrived at the depot at Dej as evening was falling. The inventory was there, 2 crates of medical supplies, and 4 drums of lamp oil. The return journey by mountain road after dark with a laden pack horse was a genuine risk, and I made the decision to overnight at the depot and return in the morning. I sent a note to Ballin with the depot's evening rider, informing him of this decision. I do not know whether the rider reached the fortress. I do not know whether the note was received. I returned the following morning. I came up the valley road from Dej in the early light, the pack horse following behind. The forest on either side of the road was very still. There had been a frost overnight, and the fallen leaves were silver at the edges in the morning light. I noticed the quiet before I reached the final approach. The valley was not quiet at that hour under ordinary circumstances. There were birds, usually, crows in the spruce tops, the small birds that moved through the undergrowth. That morning there was nothing. No bird called, no branch moved. The valley was quiet in the way it is quiet during a hard winter storm when all the animals go to ground, but the sky was clear and there was no storm coming. The fortress gates were open. I saw them from 300 meters down the approach road, standing open in the early morning light. The left gate swung fully back against the exterior wall, the right gate at an angle. They should not have been open. They were never open at that hour. The drop bar that secured them from the inside required 2 men to lift. For those gates to be standing open at dawn, someone inside had opened them from within. I tied the horses to a post at the road and went forward on foot. I drew my sidearm. My hands were steady. I was in the state a soldier enters when something is wrong and action is required. A focused suspension, where the mind sharpens on what is in front of it, and the rest falls away. The first thing I noticed was the smell, cold stone and something older, something that had been enclosed for a long time. Not the smell of decomposition, or not primarily. Something below decay, something more primitive. The way a very old sealed place smells when it is opened for the first time in a long while. The second thing I noticed was the absence of sound. A working garrison at dawn makes noise. The stable makes noise. The cook fire makes noise. Men moving between the barracks and the latrines make noise. Fortress Karashegi at dawn, on the 3rd of November, 1888, made no sound at all. Not a horse, not a boot, not a voice, not a fire, nothing. I entered through the gate. In the outer court, the 2 sentries who should have been at the gate were at the gate. They were standing at their posts, weapons in hand, leaning against the wall in the posture of men who have been on watch for many hours. They were dead. I knew it as soon as I saw them. Not from any single obvious sign, but from the aggregate, the particular stillness, the angle of the lean, the absolute absence of the small, constant motion that living men make. They were still, and had been still for some hours. I went to the nearest man. He was Private Ola, a 23-year-old from the eastern lowlands, who had been in the regiment for 2 years. His face was very pale, and his lips were slightly open, and his eyes were half closed in a way that looked like sleep, except that his body was too still for sleep. At his throat there were 2 wounds. 2 circular punctures on the left side of the neck, directly over the vessel, each perhaps 8 millimeters across, the skin around them unbruised and unbroken, the punctures themselves clean and precise, as if made by an instrument of specific size. Below the wounds, 2 channels of dried blood had run down the neck to the collar. There was very little blood, not the amount that should have been there for a wound to that vessel, far less. I checked the other sentry. The same wounds, the same pallor, the same minimal blood. I moved through the outer court, to the inner gate, and through it into the main court. Every man I found was at his post or at his station, wherever his duties had placed him. The cook at the fire pit, the ladle in his hand, the fire long cold beneath the cook-pot. The officer's runner, standing at the base of the keep staircase, as if he had been on his way up or down, and had simply stopped. The night watch supervisor in the watch chair outside the main corridor entrance, his log open on his knee, his pen on the ground where it had fallen when his hand relaxed. Every man had the same wounds. I went through the fortress room by room, section by section, counting. I counted 43 dead men. The count was exact. The entire garrison. I want the commission to understand the spatial distribution. The men were found across every section of the fortress, the outer court, the inner court, the keep, the barracks on the 2nd and 3rd levels, the storage areas, the watch stations on all 4 walls, the stable. The distribution covered an area of perhaps 4,000 square meters. Whatever killed 43 men in that fortress killed them all at approximately the same time, or within a window so narrow that no man had time to run from where he was to anywhere else. Poisoning does not do that. The Commission's medical examiner has offered contaminated water as a mechanism. I ask the Commission to consider the spatial distribution. Men do not all fall at their stations simultaneously from a waterborne illness. They fall where the illness takes them, in corridors, in latrines, in bunks, collapsed on their way somewhere. These men fell at their posts. The men in the bunks fell in the bunks, but each man in his own bunk, each in the posture of a man who lay down to sleep rather than a man who collapsed, as if whatever came had moved through every room, every station, every dark corner of that fortress in sequence, and had taken each man where he stood or lay, without any man having time to cry out, or to move, or to know what was happening. In the great hall of the keep, in the center of the stone floor, I found Captain Balin's silver regimental badge. It was lying face down in the center of the whole floor, and it had been pressed into the stone. Not placed, pressed. The soft lead-silver alloy of the badge had been deformed. The metal bent double as if compressed between 2 flat surfaces of enormous weight, and the stone floor beneath it was cracked in a circle of approximately 30 centimeters, hairline fractures radiating outward from where the badge had been driven in, as if whatever had pressed it down had done so with a force that the stone could barely absorb. I stood in the center of that empty hall with 43 dead men distributed through the fortress around me, and I turned the bent silver badge in my hands. Then I put it in my coat pocket. The badge is in my coat pocket now. It is what I have to account for what I found in that fortress. It is the only thing I cannot explain away. I found Balin in his office. He was seated at his desk in the posture of a man who has been writing, leaning forward slightly, his pen still loosely held between 2 fingers, his other hand flat on the surface of the desk. On the desk before him was his final report, the document he had been composing for regimental command. He had written 4 lines. The 4th line ended mid-sentence. The vibration began again at approximately 11 in the evening, and this time it did not. The sentence did not finish. Whatever he had been going to say when he began that sentence, he did not finish saying it. I stood in that office for a long time. I stood, and I looked at Balin, and at the unfinished sentence, and at the pen still held loosely in his dead hand, and I thought about 20 years of service, and about a man who had done everything correctly, who had followed every protocol, who had responded with discipline and reason to each thing that presented itself, and about how none of it had mattered. Then I heard it. I was in the north corridor, walking toward the outer gate to collect my horse. I was thinking about what road to take to Dej and how long it would take me to get there. Practical thoughts. The thoughts of a man managing what is in front of him, and the vibration began. It began in the floor, not faintly, not at the edge of perception. It began in the floor of that corridor with a force that I felt immediately through the soles of my boots, and that moved upward through my legs and into my chest and jaw. It was not the distant pulse that the men had described on the night watch. It was not the sustained background resonance that had settled into the mess hall on the 30th. It was direct and close and rising, and as it rose, the walls on either side of me began to conduct it, and the stone arch overhead, and within 10 or 12 seconds the entire corridor was vibrating around me, as if the limestone of which it was built had become a single instrument struck by something enormous below, and I was standing inside it, inside the sound, and the sound was everything. I ran. I ran through that corridor and through the outer gate and down the approach road, and I did not stop running until I reached my horses. I untied them with hands that I could feel shaking, and I mounted and I rode. I rode without looking back, and I rode without stopping for 2 hours. At Dej, I made my initial verbal report to the depot commander, who had the presence of mind to write it down as I spoke. Then I sat in the depot kitchen and drank the coffee that someone put in front of me, and I looked at my hands until they were still again. The military inquiry team arrived at Kereshegi on the 5th of November. I did not accompany them. Their preliminary report notes 43 dead, wounds consistent with puncture injuries to the carotid region, no signs of forced entry, no evidence of an external assailant, possible contamination of the water supply as a mechanism for the deaths. The report does not mention the regimental badge. Either it was not found, or it was found and not included. I do not know which. I carry the badge. The commission has asked me to surrender it as physical evidence. I will surrender it if I am required to do so. But I want the record to reflect that the commission's poisoning theory does not bend silver double. It does not press an alloy badge into 600-year-old limestone with enough force to crack the stone beneath it. Something else does that. I do not know what it was. I have not tried to name it. The old note in the 1743 ledger called it something in Romanian that translates to something that breathes in stone. I am a supply officer. I deal in knowable things. I am not equipped to name what lives below Fortress Kereshegi. I am only equipped to tell the commission what I found, and to ask that the record not be falsified in order to make those findings easier to file. There is one last thing I want to tell the commission. Since the 3rd of November, I have not slept soundly. I wake usually between 2 and 4 in the morning. In the first seconds of waking, I can feel it, the vibration. Not in any stone floor, just the memory of it, I have told myself. The nervous system's memory of a sensation that was strong enough to leave a record in the body. That is what I have told myself. I have told myself that for 6 weeks. Last night, in my room here at the Garrison quarters in Cluj-Napoca, I woke at approximately 3 in the morning. I lay in the dark with my eyes open, listening to the building around me. The building was still. I began to relax back towards sleep, and then I felt it, in the floorboards beneath my bed, in the plaster of the wall behind my head. A vibration, faint and brief and unmistakable. 5 seconds. Perhaps 6, then gone. I lay awake until morning. I pressed my ear to the floor before I rose. The floor was silent. The floor was still. There was nothing there. But I lay with my ear on the floor for 20 minutes before I was willing to believe it. I want this testimony in the record. All of it. I am going to resign my commission, and I am going to leave Cluj-Napoca. and I am going to put as many kilometers between myself and the Carpathian foothills as I can manage. And I want someone to know why. Do not go below the sealed room. That is what the man in 1743 wrote. He wrote it in the margin of a supply ledger, because he needed someone to know, and because a supply ledger was what he had. The inquiry will find its mechanism. It will write its conclusion. The fortress will be inspected and possibly decommissioned, and the file will be closed. But somewhere, in whatever archive this commission sends its raw transcripts to, there will be a record of what I said in this room today. And if someone finds it and reads it, and decides to send another garrison to Fortress Karashegi, I want that record to be what stands between them and the decision they are about to make. Feed it or wall it. There is no third choice. We did neither, and 43 men paid the cost of that. I have nothing further to add. I will sign the record, and then I am going to leave.